All right, let's go. Number 10. The Goseck Circle. In 1991, an aerial archaeologist named Otto Brasch was photographing crop marks over the Saale Valley in Saxony-Anhalt. He passed above a wheat field outside the village of Goseck, and there was a ring in the crop. The wheat was growing at a different rate along a circle roughly 70 meters across. The soil beneath it had been dug out and refilled a very long time ago. Excavation ran from 2002 to 2004 under François Berthim of the Martin Luther University of Halle-Wittenberg, and around 40 radiocarbon determinations placed the construction of the enclosure in the 49th century BC, with use continuing into the 47th. The people who dug it were early farmers of the stroke-ornamented pottery culture. They had no metal and no writing. That is nearly 7,000 years ago. It is roughly 19 centuries before the first ditch was cut at Stonehenge. It is more than 2,000 years before anyone laid the first course of a pyramid. What they built was a ring ditch, a little over 70 meters wide and up to 1 meter 80 deep, with 2 circles of upright timber standing inside it. There were 3 ways in. One faced north. The other 2 faced southwest and southeast. Those 2 southern gates are the reason anyone still talks about Goseck. Wolfhard Schlosser, an astronomer at the Ruhr University in Bochum, worked out where they point. At around 4,800 BC, the southeastern passage faced the midwinter sunrise, and the southwestern passage faced the midwinter sunset to an accuracy of 3 or 4 days. A gate here is not a doorway in a fence. Each entrance cuts through the ditch and through both timber rings. So a person at the center is looking down a corridor with 3 openings lined up ahead of them. That is what turns a wide horizon into a single direction. It is not a byproduct of building a fence. A fence can be put anywhere. A sightline has to be found first, and then it has to be kept. Somebody chose where the corridor pointed and then made the choice permanent. Then, the same test was applied to everything else of its kind. Around 140 of these enclosures are now known across Central Europe in Germany, Austria, the Czech lands, Slovakia, and Hungary. In 2019, Georg Zotti and Wolfgang Neubauer reported on more than 30 of them in Lower Austria. Their conclusion was blunt. The entrances mostly follow the slope of the ground, running up and down hill with the local terrain, and they found one noteworthy exception. Across the class, the gates track the landscape rather than the sky. German heritage archaeologists have said in print that calling Goseck the oldest observatory in the world is not defensible. It is a phrase for brochures. What we are left with is narrower and more interesting. The 2 southern gates at Goseck do point where Schlosser says they point. 3 or 4 days is not instrumental precision. But this is a building that fixes a direction and a season and holds them there for centuries, raised by people who had been farming for only a few generations. They left other things in the ditch. Cattle skulls and horn cores were heaped at the southern gates. There was also human bone, worked carefully enough that the flesh had been scraped from it, and that is the disturbing part of the site. What went on inside that ring is unresolved. Nothing in the soil explains it. And nobody in that valley would write anything down for another 5,000 years. In 2005, the enclosure was rebuilt on the original ground, with roughly 1,700 oak posts and open to the public on the winter solstice. Visitors now stand inside a wooden ring younger than they are and watch the sun come up through a gap. The posts are new. The direction is not. Number 9. The Berlin Gold Hat. In a case in the Neues Museum in Berlin stands a cone of gold. It is 74.5 centimeters tall, rising from a narrow brim to a blunt point, and it weighs 490 grams. The sheet it is made from averages 0.06 of a millimeter thick. That is thinner than the paper in an office printer. The entire cone was raised from one piece of it without a seam and without a tear. The surface is covered in stamped ornament applied with 17 tools. 14 were individual punches. 3 were decorated wheels. There are discs with 2, 3, 5 rhombs or 6 concentric rings. A double frieze of crescents and an 8-spoked star at the tip. From brim to point, the ornament is organized into roughly 20 horizontal bands. It is extraordinary metalwork by any standard, and it is one of only 4 such cones known. Nobody knows where it came from. It surfaced on the international art market in 1995, and the Museum für Vor- und Frühgeschichte bought it the following year. The story attached to it is a Swiss private collection assembled in the 1950s and 60s. There is no find spot, no soil, no layer, no associated object, and no documented chain of custody before the 1990s. The reason the thing can be dated at all is a field near Schifferstadt in the Rhineland. On the 29th of April, 1835, a laborer there dug into a cone of gold standing upright about 60 centimeters down, set on a slab of clay with 3 bronze axes leaning against it. That deposit belongs to roughly 1400 to 1300 BC. The type is securely Bronze Age, even when an individual example is not. Then there is the arithmetic, which is what made these objects famous. Wilfried Mengen, the director of the Berlin Museum, published a reading of the ornament in 2000 and again in a book in 2010. Count every ring on every stamped symbol across the whole cone, and the total is 1,739. Read as days that is a little over 59 lunar months. Multiply by 4, and it approaches the 19-year cycle in which the phases of the moon return to the same points of the solar year. Certain bands are designated as intercalary and subtracted rather than added. On that reading, the hat is a device for converting between the moon and the sun. The problem is the counting. 1,739 is not written anywhere on the object. It is a total produced by decisions taken by the person doing the reading. Which rings count? Whether the dividing bands are included. How many bands there are, since the published tables cannot agree on 19 or 21. Which of them get subtracted? In 2008, Andreas Fulz at the Technical University of Berlin tested the idea properly, taking the circle counts on all 4 gold cones and checking them against the lunar month, the solar month, the tropical year, and the synodic periods of 5 planets. Random expectation was 6.77%. The Berlin hat returned 6.58% for the lunar month and 0.43% for the year. That is at or below chance on everything tested. Only the Schifferstadt cone beat chance, and only against the lunar month. Harold Meller has put the field's position plainly. Most archaeologists are not sure whether this is a calendar or a coincidence. None of that makes the hat a forgery. The alloy and the punch technology match the cones that came out of the ground properly. But a calendar is not only arithmetic. It is arithmetic tied to a place, a latitude, and a horizon. Numbers like these can only be tested against the sky. Somebody was actually standing under. And we cannot do that here. It was lifted out of the earth by a person who never said where. And the ground that would settle the argument went with them. Number 8. The temple that catches the equinox. On the southern coast of Malta, on a shelf of limestone above the sea, 3 stone buildings sit inside a low fence. They look east across open water toward the uninhabited islet of Filfla. The site is called Mnajdra, and it went up in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. The 3 were not built together. The smallest and oldest is a 3-lobed structure at the top of the slope. The one that matters here is the lower building with a concave facade and a doorway that faces the sea. That doorway points almost exactly east. On the mornings around the equinoxes, the rising sun comes straight down it and along the central corridor inside. On the mornings around the solstices, it does something less obvious. The first light misses the middle of the doorway entirely and passes along the sides of it, landing on decorated slabs inside the first chamber. One slab in June, a different one in December. Chris Mikolev took a theodolite to the site and put the main axis of the lower building at 92 degrees and 30 minutes, computed against the horizon, as it stood around 2875 BC. The declination that comes out of that is 0. 0 declination is the celestial equator, which is another way of saying the equinox. In 2022, Robert Barrett at Queen's University Belfast tested the class instead of the building. He reconstructed 23 Maltese temple sites in 3 dimensions and fired simulated sunlight at them across the range, 3,600 to 2,100 BC. Mnajdra came out between 0.87 and 1.25 degrees off the spring equinox sunrise and a little further off the autumn one. That is roughly 1 to 1.5 times the width of the sun itself. He calls it an excellent alignment. The same study found something the headlines left out. Not one Maltese temple has a significant solstice alignment on its main axis. With the exception of Mnajdra, not one has a significant solar or lunar alignment of any kind. One site out of 23 is close to what we should expect from chance alone. There is a second difficulty, and it is a general one. An equinox cannot be watched. It has to be calculated or found by halving the interval between two solstices and counting the days. Meanwhile, due east is equinox sunrise on a flat horizon by definition. So any east-facing door on a Mediterranean coast arrives near this result for nothing. Mikolev, who measured it, was careful about exactly that. His own published caveat is that the situation could be sheer coincidence, since to date there is no evidence of intent. In 2017, Frank Ventura and George Agius went looking for the missing evidence in the obvious place. They walked the karst ground, east of the temple, hunting for markers on the skyline, and found two possible post holes. The southern one could have marked the midwinter sunrise fairly accurately. The other sits about 3 degrees from the midsummer sunrise. 3 degrees is 6 times the width of the sun, and it is not an alignment. Nothing we have found on that ground settles the question either way. What holds up better than the equinox is the solstice light on the slabs. That effect depends on the thickness of the door jambs and on the position of two particular decorated stones inside the chamber. It is much harder to arrive at by accident than a door facing east. On the 13th of April, 2001, vandals got into the site at night. They toppled or broke about 60 megaliths and cut graffiti into the stones. And UNESCO called it the worst act of vandalism the island had suffered. It was a brutal few hours of work on a building that had stood for 5,000 years. The stones were raised again. Since 2009, Mnajdra has stood under an open-sided tent of steel arches and fabric membrane, put up to slow the rain, the salt, and the temperature swings that are dissolving the limestone. The people who installed it called it an interim measure, rated for 25 or 30 years. The light still arrives every March and September along the corridor exactly as it did. It arrives under a roof. Number 7. The box above the door. On the morning of the 21st of December, 1967, Michael O'Kelly stood in the dark inside a mound in the Boyne Valley. He was professor of archaeology at University College Cork, and he was there to find out whether a local story was true. People living around Newgrange had been telling him the sun got into it. The mound is about 85 meters across and 13 meters high. A passage runs into it for 18.9 meters, roughly a meter wide, and opens into a chamber with a corbelled roof nearly 6 meters above the floor. It was built around 3200 BC. That date comes from the caulking, a putty of burnt soil packed into the joints of the passage roof to keep water out. Somebody in 3200 BC had already worked out that a roof of stacked slabs leaks and sealed every joint of it by hand. 5,000 years later, the chamber is still dry. The story could not be true through the doorway, and O'Kelly knew it. The passage floor climbs about 2 meters between the entrance and the chamber. Light coming in at door height lands on the floor of the passage and stops there. Above and behind the entrance, there is a second opening. It is a stone box about 90 centimeters high and a meter wide. The part that does the work is the slit between the first two roof slabs, a meter across and between 18 and 22 centimeters high. The chamber floor, that slit, and the horizon all lie on one plane. A block of crystalline quartz was found at its inner end, scratched along its faces from being slid back and forth. A shutter. Nothing else in the mound requires that opening. The only job it has is to let light in over the top of the door. The light came up the passage that morning and reached the chamber. It lasted about 17 minutes. In 1989, the astronomer Tom Ray of the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies published the measurements in Nature. And at the time of construction, the midwinter sun rose at an azimuth of 133 degrees, 54 minutes, give or take 4 minutes of arc. The passage points along a range from 133 degrees, 49 minutes, to 137 degrees, 29 minutes. The tilt of the Earth's axis was then 24 degrees, 2 minutes. His conclusion was that the orientation was deliberate, and that this is the oldest structure known for certain to have an astronomical function. But here is where the story turns back on itself. Newgrange as it stands is a reconstruction. In 2017, Robert Hensey pointed out that during the restoration, as leaning uprights were straightened, two of the passage roof stones were lifted by nearly 50 centimeters. In his words, this appears to have enhanced, if not entirely facilitated, the capacity of the solar beam to pass into the chamber. O'Kelly saw the phenomenon for the first time only after that section of the monument had been taken apart and put back together. That is the unsettling part of the most famous sunrise in European archaeology. The roof box itself is not a modern invention, and that claim has been made and answered. Photographs from around 1880 and from 1935 show the lintel sitting at the same height in the same place, before anyone excavated anything. What we cannot recover is the fine behavior of the light in 3200 BCE, because the geometry that produces it now has passed through 20th century hands. The instrument is also drifting. The beam today enters about 4 minutes after sunrise rather than at sunrise. Because the tilt of the Earth has changed, it now stops roughly 2 meters short of the back recess it once reached. The passage is aimed at a sky that has moved. None of that has dimmed the appetite for it. The chamber is open for 5 mornings a year, from the 19th to the 23rd of December. In 2025, the Irish state ran a lottery for the places inside it. More than 16,000 people entered. 38 were drawn. 5,000 years on the aperture still performs the only task it was ever cut for. Once a year for a quarter of an hour. It is simply no longer aimed where it was aimed. Number 6. The platform that measured the year in gaps. Between December 2003 and December 2004, He Nu and Wu Jiabi climbed onto a rammed earth foundation in Shanxi province 45 times before dawn. Each time they stood in the same spot and watched the sun come up. They were checking a building against the sky. The building sits inside Taosi in Shangfin County, a walled Longshan period settlement occupied from about 2300 to 1900 BC. At its height, the Middle Period wall enclosed 280 hectares, which made it one of the largest walled settlements in Neolithic China. More than 1,500 burials have been excavated there. 9 of them held over 200 objects, each jades a copper bell, pottery drums chiming stones. The structure was excavated in 2003 and 2004 by the Institute of Archaeology of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. It is a semicircular rammed earth platform on 3 terraces about 40 meters across east to west. Cut into the outer terrace is a row of narrow foundation slots, 15 to 20 centimeters wide. 10.5 meters in front of them sits a small circular foundation with 3 concentric rings inside it. That is where a person stood. From that one point, 11 uprights on the outer terrace and 2 on the terrace behind combine into 13 pillars with 12 gaps between them. Only the foundations survive. Every pillar in every photograph of Taosi is a modern reconstruction, and the height of them is an estimate. That has to be said before anything else, because every sightline depends on it. The observations showed that the sun comes up out of the mountain, Taiershan, and appears in particular gaps on particular days. Gap 2 at midwinter, Gap 12 at midsummer, Gap 7 near the equinoxes. Most gaps are used twice, going north and coming back. He Nu reads the arrangement as 20 divisions of the agricultural year. Radiocarbon puts the platform at 4,100 to 4,000 years old. In 2009, Wu Jiabi, Chen Meidong, and Liu Ziyuan derived a second date from the geometry itself, using the change in the Earth's tilt implied by the slot positions, and got 4,026 years before AD 2000, give or take 115. The 2 dates agree. The authors also state that the calculation assumes the very slot assignment it is meant to be testing, which is the kind of honesty this subject usually lacks. What makes this platform harder to dismiss than most claimed observatories is that somebody went and stood on it before dawn 45 times. It was tested against the sky rather than against a model. It did not pass cleanly. In 2008, David Pancanier, Liu Qiyuan, and Salvo de Mies published the assessment that remains the strongest objection to the site. 3 of the slots do not point at the observation position at all. One has an effective opening of 9/100ths of a degree, roughly a fifth of the width of the sun through which nothing whatever can be seen. The slot assigned to the equinoxes delivers sunrise 3 days after the autumn equinox and 3 days before the spring one. The rammed Earth arc they note conforms poorly to the arc of a circle. Their reconstruction is that the pillars were laid out one after another by trial and error, and the error accumulated as the row went on. They recommend abandoning the word observatory altogether. Note who signed that paper. Liu Qiyuan is also a co-author of the supportive study. The same specialist has argued both sides, which is roughly where the evidence sits. In the site's final phase, Taosi was torn apart from the inside. The wall was breached. The palace was destroyed. The elite graves were broken open and emptied, and the platform was pulled down. The 24 solar terms printed in Chinese calendars today are first listed in full in a text of 139 BCE. 2,000 years after this platform was flattened, and no line of transmission between them has ever been demonstrated. Nothing at Taosi was written, so we have the ground plan of an extraordinary instrument and no instructions for it. What was destroyed there was not really a structure. It was a method for reading a mountain, and it only worked for a person standing on one particular circle of Earth who already knew which gap to watch. Number 5. The Newark Octagon. In 1982, 2 members of the faculty at Earlham College in Indiana published a survey of an earthwork in Licking County, Ohio. Ray Hively is an astronomer. Robert Horn is a philosopher. The Hopewell built the largest set of geometric earthen enclosures anywhere in the world here across a complex that once covered more than 4 square miles. Most of it is under a town now. What survives includes an octagon enclosing about 20 hectares. Its 8 walls are each roughly 170 meters long, standing 1.5 to nearly 2 meters high. Every one of the 8 gateways is screened by a small mound set just inside it. A short avenue joins the octagon to a circle 321 meters across. The work belongs to the first few centuries, AD. It is not oriented on the sun. It is oriented on the moon. The sun's rising point travels between 2 limits and back once a year. Any farmer learns it in a season. The moon's rising point sweeps through a much wider range every single month. The width of that sweep expands and contracts over 18.6 years. At the maximum, the moon rises further north and further south inside 1 month than the sun manages in a year. That gives 8 extreme positions, northern and southern, rising and setting at the maximum and at the minimum. Now consider what it takes to find them. A solstice recurs annually and can be checked against last year. A standstill recurs once in 18.6 years. And it is not a sharp event because for about a year, the limiting position barely moves at all. The moon also runs through its full range every 27 days, so an observer has to know in advance which month is worth watching. Establishing the pattern takes records longer than a working lifetime. Nobody works this out alone, and what we are looking at is a number no single observer could have measured. It has to be inherited to exist at all. The claim is that the main axis of the circle and octagon points to the northern extreme of moonrise. In the developed version of the argument, all 8 standstill directions are embedded in the geometry to sub-degree precision when measured over the local horizon. The obvious objection is that an octagon does much of that work by itself. Opposite sides are parallel, so once one axis is fixed, several other directions follow from the shape rather than from a decision. Hively and Horn answered with simulation, generating more than 10 billion randomly oriented octagons. The odds against chance ran from about 1 in 1,000 under their most generous assumptions to 1 in 40 million under the ones they consider realistic. In 2004, Christopher Turner tested the original claims independently using chi-square and resampling methods and came out at roughly 1 in 1500 for the combination of hitting the lunar extremes while avoiding the solar ones. He also observed that the embankments are distorted away from a perfect octagon and toward the lunar directions. The counterweight is official. In 2023, assessing the site for the World Heritage List, ICOMOS wrote that the astronomical alignment is not as well documented in the nomination dossier, and noted that the supporting work came from a limited group of researchers. The Hopewell ceremonial earthworks were inscribed that September for architectural achievement and cultural tradition, not for the astronomy. Brad Lepper of the Ohio History Connection, who is sympathetic to the lunar case, went out to field test a widely published solstice claim at the same earthwork. He reported that the alignment was not even close. And then, there is what happened to the ground itself. From 1910, the Octagon was leased to a country club and became a golf course. A lease signed in 1997 ran to 2078. The Ohio History Connection moved to take the leasehold back in 2018. The Ohio Supreme Court decided the case in December 2022. Public access to the earthwork began on the 1st of January 2025. The moon reached its northern extreme through 2024 and 2025, while the lawyers were still finishing. For more than a century, an instrument built to hold a number that takes 18.6 years to measure had been maintained as fairway and green. It came back into public hands during the first standstill in a generation. The next one falls in 2043. Number 4. The moon between the spires. Two rock spires stand on a high ridge in southern Colorado above the Piedra River, with a narrow gap between them. They are called Chimney Rock and Companion Rock. They are natural. Nobody put them there, and nobody cut the gap. What people did here was decide where to stand. On the ridge below them, on the highest flat ground available roughly 1,000 feet above the valley floor, sits a masonry great house of the kind built in Chaco Canyon, 90 miles to the south. It is the highest and one of the most remote of the Chacoan outliers. There is no water on that ridge and no farmland on it. Every stone, every roof beam, and every drop of water used in the building had to be carried up. There is no defensive advantage worth that climb either. There is one thing visible from that ridge which is not visible from the easy ground below, from the great house and from a narrow strip of ground that includes it and very little else. The moon at its northern extreme rises in the gap between the two spires. The sun cannot do this. The sun never travels far enough north along the horizon to reach that notch. Only the moon gets there, and only in the year or so around the maximum of the same 18.6-year cycle that runs beneath the earthwork in Ohio. A standstill is not a night. It is a season, once in a generation. So the sightline is real, and the geometry is not in dispute. The question hanging over every claim of this kind is whether anybody noticed. At Chimney Rock, there is an answer, and it is the reason this entry sits where it does. The great house was built with timber, and timber can be dated by counting rings. The beams give 2 construction episodes, one in 1076, one in 1093. Both years fall in the seasons when the moon was reaching its northern standstill limit. That is a different order of evidence from an alignment. An alignment is only a direction, and directions can be arrived at by accident. A date is a decision. Twice 17 years apart, people hauled heavy timber up 1,000 feet of ridge to build. In a year when the moon was doing something, it does about twice in a human lifetime. J. McKim Malville, the astronomer at the University of Colorado, who developed the argument, has been careful about how much weight it will carry, and the caution is warranted. Here is what pulls the other way. Later excavation produced earlier dates in 1011 and 1018. So people were working on that ridge long before either standstill. Timber can be stored salvaged and reused, which means a cutting date is not automatically a building date. Several hundred people lived on the mesa below in ordinary houses farming ordinary fields, and the great house had ordinary functions too. Archaeologists do not agree on what the site was for. The astronomy is one reading among several that the same stones will support. The Chimney Rock Archaeological Area was made a national monument in 2012, and the argument is still open. What the two dates do is change the shape of the problem. Almost everywhere else, the argument runs from a wall to a horizon, and then hopes. Here it runs from the horizon to a calendar year, and the calendar year was recovered by counting rings in wood that is still standing in the building. The haunting part is what the cycle demands of the people doing the counting. 18.6 years is longer than a working career, and roughly a third of a lifetime in that period. The first observation and the confirming one belong to different pairs of eyes. The count has to survive the gap between them carried by somebody who will not personally see the next one. It survived. Somebody in 1093 knew what somebody in 1076 had seen and acted on it hard enough to move timber up a mountain. The ridge is empty now, and the gap between the spires is exactly where it was. Nobody wrote the countdown. It was held and people taught, repeated, and checked against a horizon once a generation. And it went out of the world with the last person who carried it. What that generation left instead is a stack of cut timber on a waterless ridge inside a building nobody needed to put there. The wood is still in the walls. Its rings still hold the year the moon came back. Number 3. The 13 Towers of Chankillo. For most of a century, the ruins in the Casma Valley on the coast of Peru were read as a fort, and the reading was reasonable. On the hill stands a temple wrapped in 3 concentric walls with baffled gateways that cannot be walked through in a straight line. Excavation produced ceramic figurines of warriors carrying spear throwers, darts, maces, and shields. At the end of the site's life, the walls, the pillars, and the religious images were deliberately smashed. Then, there is the other thing on the site which never fitted the fort at all. Along a low ridge below the hill runs a line of 13 stone towers, between 2 and 6 meters high, set 4.7 to 5.1 meters apart, each with a pair of staircases running up its sides. They enclose nothing. They defend nothing. The northern towers were built taller to compensate for the ridge dropping away, which keeps all 13 tops level. The complex around them covers about 4 square kilometers. In March 2007, Ivan Gezi and Clive Ruggles published what the line is for in Science under a title that says it plainly. Chankillo, a 2,300-year-old solar observatory in coastal Peru. Their paper notes that this precedes the sun pillars of Inca Cusco by nearly 2,000 years. 235 meters from the towers, on either side stand 2 buildings at roughly the same elevation. From the western one, an observer watches the sun rise across the row. From the eastern one, it sets into it. The 13 towers form an artificial toothed horizon, and that horizon spans almost exactly the full annual travel of the sunrise and the sunset. In December, the sun rises out of the tower at one end of the row. In June, it goes down into the tower at the other. What makes Chankillo different from almost everything else built before? It is that it is not a marker. It is a scale. The sun rises in a given gap for only 1 or 2 days. So, an observer on that spot could fix the date to within 2 or 3 days on any morning of the year, not only at the solstices. A solstice alignment gives 2 dates out of 365. This gives all of them, which is an extraordinary thing to find on a desert ridge 2,300 years ago. The western viewing position is the strong part of the case because the architecture funnels a person to it. It sits inside a building reached along a walled corridor 2.4 meters wide. Between walls 2.2 meters high, entered through a restricted doorway. The corridor ends in an opening with no door facing the towers. Offerings were left along it. Whoever watched the sun from there was escorted in. The framing in the paper is a sun cult rather than a farming office, and the architecture supports it. Somebody controlled the count, and somebody controlled who was allowed to see it taken. The eastern position is the weak part, and the authors say so themselves. Only poor foundations survive. The exact position cannot be known with certainty, and they placed it by analogy with the western building to be confirmed by future excavation. Half of the instrument rests on an inferred spot on the ground. The site was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2021, but not under the name it was nominated with. On the recommendation of ICOMOS, Chankillo Solar Observatory and Ceremonial Center became Chankillo Archaeo-Astronomical Complex. because the uses related to observation of the sky in their wording remain to be further explored. The heritage body declined to certify the word observatory. Radiocarbon puts the whole complex between roughly 400 and 200 BC. It was built used and abandoned inside a short span, in a period when fortifications were going up across the valley, and warfare was becoming a standing consideration for everyone living there. So the towers were never the instrument. What does the work is the space between them, plus 2 positions on the ground, plus a person who knows which gap the sun should be in this week. Only the first of those 3 is made of stone, and one of the other 2 we are not certain we have found. At inscription, the towers were about 60% deteriorated, cracked, and at risk of collapse. Number 2. The Nebra Sky Disc. On the 4th of July, 1999, 2 men with a metal detector were digging on the Mittelberg, a wooded hill above the Unstrut in Saxony-Anhalt, and struck metal with a pickaxe. They brought up a bronze plate about 32 centimeters across, weighing around 2 kilos. With it came 2 swords, 2 axes, a chisel, and 2 arm rings. They sold the lot the next day for 31,000 marks. Over the next 2.5 years, the disc was offered on for up to $1 million. On the 23rd of February, 2002, Harold Meller, the state archaeologist of Saxony-Anhalt, sat down in a hotel in Basel, posing as a buyer at 700,000. The Swiss police seized it there. Inlaid in the bronze in gold are a disc, a crescent, and 32 dots. 7 of the dots sit together in a tight cluster. The object was edited during its working life at least 4 times. 2 arcs were added later at the rim, and 2 dots were removed to make room for them. Each arc spans 82 degrees. At the latitude of that hill, 82 degrees, is the angle along the horizon between the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunrise. It is the entire annual travel of the sun drawn on a plate small enough to hold in both hands. The astronomer Wolfhard Schlosser identified it. Later still, a curved band was added along the bottom. And finally, a row of holes was punched around the edge before the disc went into the ground. A year counted in months runs short of a year counted in seasons. So a 13th month has to be inserted every few years to stop the calendar sliding. In 2007, Rolf Hansen of the Hamburg Planetarium argued that the disk encodes the rule for doing exactly that. In spring, look at the moon standing beside the 7-star cluster. If the crescent is a thin, new one, the year is in step. If it is as thick as the crescent shown on the disk, which is about 4.5 days old, insert the extra month. A Babylonian text states an equivalent rule in words. If the Pleiades and the moon are in conjunction on the first of the month, Nisenu the year is normal. If they are in conjunction on the 3rd, it is a leap year. But here is where the comparison runs into trouble. That compendium was assembled roughly 1,000 years after the disk was buried. Hermann Hunger, the Vienna Assyriologist who edited the modern edition of the text, does not accept the parallel. Neither does Johannes Koch. The historian of astronomy Suzanne Hoffmann adds a sharper objection. A cluster of 7 dots need not be the Pleiades at all, because people looking at that patch of sky with the naked eye tend to count 6 or 8. Rules of this kind are not attested anywhere near that early. What is not in doubt is where the materials came from. The copper was mined at Mitterberg in the Austrian Alps. The gold of the earliest phase was matched to the Carnon in Cornwall by Anja Acer Gregor Borg and Ernst Pernicka in 2011 on 6 trace elements at once. And an antler pick from one of those Cornish workings dates to between 1620 and 1497 BC. The date has been fought over. In 2020, Rupert Gebhardt in Munich and Rüdiger Krauss in Frankfurt argued that the find spot was unreliable and the disk was an Iron Age object. The answer came from Pernicka and 12 colleagues. Soil still stuck to the disk matched the find spot at 95%. More decisively, the undisturbed layer beneath the looter's pit was loaded with copper and gold at more than 10 times the local background. Metal had been leaching out of something buried on that hill for a very long time. The truly unsettling part is not the theft. It is that everything capable of telling us what the object was doing there was destroyed in a single night. The pit, the layers, the orientation, All of it went in a few hours of digging by torchlight. The pickaxe left 2 marks on the rim, which were later cast in plaster and produced in court. So the oldest surviving picture of the sky sits in a case in Holly with the arcs it was given and the scars of its recovery. The last thing its owners did with it was take it out of use, punch a row of holes around its edge, and bury it on a hill. From that hill, at midsummer, the sun goes down behind the highest mountain of the Harts. Number 1. Warren Field. A field on the north bank of the Dee at Crathes in Aberdeenshire has been photographed from the air for half a century, because in certain summers the crop growing on it does something odd. A line of dark spots comes up through the barley in a shallow arc about 50 meters long. Marks like that appear only when the crop is under stress, which means the field keeps its own timetable for showing them. The Royal Commission recorded it first in 1976 and again in 1983, 2004, and 2005. At least 22 features show in the crop. Hilary and Charles Murray of Murray Archaeological Services excavated there for the National Trust for Scotland in 2004, 2005, and 2006. They found 12 pits in an arc of 3 curving sections. They run between 1 and 2.5 meters across and up to 1.3 meters deep. Only 2 of the 12 held any trace of a post. The rest held charcoal and stones that had been carried in from somewhere else, and then more charcoal after they were recut. Then the charcoal was dated, and the dates are the reason anyone outside Aberdeenshire has heard of this field. The pits were dug around 8000 BC. That is the Mesolithic, not farmers. Hunter-gatherers in a landscape the ice had left only a few thousand years before. With no pottery, no metal, no domesticated animals, and no agriculture anywhere in Britain. Writing would not be invented anywhere on Earth for another 4,500 years. The pits were also maintained. They were recut repeatedly across a span of centuries. And then, roughly 4,000 years after they were first dug, somebody came back to the same 12 holes and cut them again. In 2013, Vincent Gaffney of the University of Birmingham published a reading of the Ark with 16 co-authors. The title is Time and a Place, a lunisolar time reckoner from 8th millennium BC Scotland. 12 pits, 12 months of a lunar year. The sizes and shapes change along the arc, and the authors describe the sequence as suggestive of the phases of the moon running from a sliver up to full and back down again. That leaves the problem every lunar calendar has. 12 lunar months are about 11 days short of the solar year. So a count of months drifts out of the seasons almost immediately and is useless within a decade unless something resets it. Run a line perpendicular to the arc through the one pit that sits off the curve, and it goes to the southeast toward a pass in the hills. At around 8000 BC, the midwinter sun rose in that pass. One sightline once a year to put the count back where it belongs. Except that almost none of this can be nailed down, and the authors are the first to say so. Their own text calls the suggestion hypothetical. No azimuth for the alignment was ever published, which means it cannot be tested the way a sightline is normally tested. The crop shows at least 22 features, and 12 of them were counted. 4 of those 12 were never excavated at all. The arc also took several hundred years to reach its full form, so nobody has shown that all 12 pits were ever open, visible, and legible at the same moment. What survives every one of those objections is still extraordinary. In the 8th millennium BC, somebody dug a deliberate arc of pits into a river terrace in northeast Scotland, aligned on nothing that stands on the ground, and their descendants kept it open for centuries. 4,000 years later, people with an entirely different economy, different tools, and different dead found the same 12 places and dug them out again. Whatever the ark was for, it was worth returning to across a gap longer than the whole of recorded history. And there is nothing to go and see. The trenches were backfilled. No stone was ever raised there, and there was probably never anything to raise. It is a working field on a Scottish estate growing a crop. And in the right summer, the pattern comes back through the barley for a few weeks and then goes again. Every instrument on this list exists for the same reason. A year is 365 days and a quarter. A lunar month is 29 and a half. The moon's swing returns to its extreme once in 18.6 years. None of those numbers is difficult. All of them are far too long and too exact to be carried in a single memory, including ours. And none of them can be checked by a person who is not standing in the right place at the right hour with something fixed to measure against. So people built the fixed thing. A ditch with a gate in it, a cone of gold, a doorway, a box above a door, a row of pillars in octagon, a pair of rock spires, 13 towers, a plate of bronze 12 holes in the ground. Those are the parts that survived. Every one of them was useless without a person who knew the count. And that person taught it to somebody else, out loud, and checked it against the horizon each year and never wrote a word of it down. There is something quietly disturbing in the arithmetic of that. In every case on this list, the hardware outlasted the knowledge that ran it. We have the machines. Nobody left us the numbers. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.